whole host of new graphics cards have just released, namely the 4070 Super. So it's only natural that we'll start seeing pre-built PCs containing these new cards. This is one of those systems, the Quantum Pro S from PCSpecialist. Let's check it out. Hi guys, I'm Matt and welcome to Kit Guru and to my full review of the Quantum Pro S pre-built PC from PCSpecialist. Obviously, we'll go through everything in detail, but straight off the bat, the overriding theme with this PC is no doubt the GPU, the 4070 Super, one of NVIDIA's latest cards. Before we look at the rest of the specs and the performance, let's get the pricing out of the way. 1,399 quid. What exactly does your 1,400 quid get you? So the CPU is an Intel Core i5-13500. It's got 14 cores and 20 threads, consisting of 6 P cores and 8 E cores. The P cores have a base clock of 2.5 GHz and are capable of boosting up to 4.8 GHz, whereas the E cores have a base clock of 1.8 GHz and are capable of boosting up to 3.5 GHz. That CPU is sitting in an ASUS Prime B760M-A Wi-Fi motherboard. That's a DDR5 board. It's got built-in Wi-Fi 6, 2 M.2 sockets. It's got 6 rear USB ports, 4 2.0 and then 2 3.2, all of which are Type A. The GPU, no doubt the star of the show, is a Zotac RTX 4070 Super Twin Edge. This is a dual fan model. It's got 12 gig of GDDR6 VRAM, a 1980 MHz base clock and a 2475 MHz boost clock. Being a 40 series card, it supports DLSS frame generation in supported titles as well. If you want a much more in-depth review of the 4070 Super, then check out Dom's recent video on them where he went through everything in much more detail. As for memory, there's 16 gig of Corsair Vengeance DDR5. That's running at 5200 megatransfers and it's made up of 2 8GB modules. Storage comes in the form of a 2TB SOLIDIGM P41 Plus Gen 4 M.2 NVMe SSD. Testing that thing with Crystal Diskmark reported write speeds of around 3,342 megabytes per second and read speeds of roughly 4,162 megabytes per second. Powering everything is a Corsair RM750E 750 watt PSU, which is fully modular and 80 plus gold rated. Keeping the CPU cool is a PCSpecialist in-house FrostFlow 100 ARGB V3 air cooler. That's got 4 6mm heat pipes and it has a 120mm ARGB fan. And then all of that stuff is sitting inside of a PCSpecialist Spectrum 2 compact mid-tower case. This case, as you can see on the desk in front of me, comes with 4 120mm fans, 3 front intake and then 1 rear exhaust. The case has 3 front USB ports, 2 2.0 and then 1 3.0, alongside headphone and microphone jack ports. So that's all of the main components. And talking about design and aesthetics and stuff like that, as far as that goes, this is quite a simple looking PC with minimal and basic RGB. It's clear that the majority of the budget has gone on the GPU. That being said though, looks aren't going to make this thing perform any better, so having one of the latest GPUs over, say, RGB memory for example, is a win in my book at this price point. The build has been put together well by PCSpecialist. Cable management is good front and back. Nothing was out of place, and you can tell that whoever built this at PCSpecialist took a bit of care when putting it together. So that's an overview of the system then. Let's move on to look at the performance. As usual, I've done nothing in terms of Windows optimization or graphics driver tweaks or anything like that. This is the out-of-box performance as you would expect to find it if you'd ordered one of these PCs. The testing was done using the release day 4070 Super driver from NVIDIA. So let's kick off the performance benchmarking then. And when I first began testing this system, I ran through the Cinebench testing as I usually do. I've got a specific order that I run through things. And I noticed a pretty weak result for the multi-core benchmark. The i5-13500 recorded a pretty measly score of just 14,729 points, placing it way below any of Leo's previously tested Intel CPUs. After doing a little digging in the BIOS, I noticed that there was a setting, ASUS Performance Enhancement, and that setting was set to off out of the box, and as such was applying some pretty strict power limits to the processor. PL1 limits were set to 65 watts and PL2 limits were 154 watts. That's the stock recommended limits for this CPU from Intel, and it was stopping the CPU from sustaining its boost speeds for more than a few seconds, which led to clock speeds boosting to 4.5 GHz for a few seconds and then dropping to 3 GHz for the majority of my Cinebench tests. Turning that setting, the performance enhancement setting on, resolved that issue by raising both the PL1 and PL2 power limits to 253 watts, essentially delimiting how much power the CPU could use, which allowed the i5 to maintain boost clock speeds for the duration of the test and landed a score of 21,032 points, much more like what we'd expect to see from this CPU. Now, I checked with PCSpecialist regarding this out-of-the-box behaviour, and it is intentional. The stock Intel power limits are enforced as they'd been seeing issues related to thermals and power on lower-end chipsets like the B760 found in this system. As we'll see later in the testing though, the cooler in this system is able to handle the increased power, so removing the power limits to test the heightened performance is a no-brainer, especially if I was using this PC, I'd remove it, and you'll see why as we go through the tests and the benchmarks. All synthetic and gaming benchmarks were carried out with those power limits removed, whereas I've tested both scenarios for the power usage, thermals and noise metrics that you'll find later in the video. Moving forward with unlimited power then. The Cinebench single score result shows that the i5 13500 comes in just a shade lower than the i5 12600K reviewed by Leo on the channel a while ago, and then quite a way off the 13600K and the 12900K as expected. Moving into 3D Mark Time Spy, I decided to compare the score to the Lunar Pro R system, also from PCSpecialist, which I reviewed on the channel a while ago. Despite being £400 cheaper when comparing the prices at the time of me reviewing them, the Quantum Pro S beats the Lunar Pro R in both the CPU and GPU scores. This really highlights the benefits of the newer 4070 Super GPU, along with the cost savings that can be found when choosing against a white build. The i5 13500 found in the Quantum Pro S may not be the fastest and the greatest CPU that Intel has to offer, but it's clear that it'll handle CPU-bound scenarios with relative ease, as well as being more than capable of providing a great gaming experience, something which we'll see more in the gaming benchmarks in a moment. Sticking to the comparison against previous PCSpecialist systems that I've reviewed then, the Quantum Pro S completed the Blender Classroom render test in 283 seconds, putting it ahead of both of the Ryzen chips found in the Lunar Pro R and in the Fusion. As for memory, the 5200 megatransfers memory found in the system recorded read speeds of 75,891 megabytes per second in Ada, and then a write result of 62,886 megabytes per second. And then finally, before we move on to look at gaming, the PC Mark X results highlight the overall performance of the system across 3 different categories. Content creation is a highlight at 14,846 points, helped no doubt by the graphics card. I'm going to talk a bit more in depth about content creation capabilities of this machine later in the video. Productivity though sits at 11,381, and then Essentials clocked a score of 10,855. The overall score of 8,776 shows that this system, while not the highest spec we've ever tested, is more than capable of handling everyday computing tasks. Let's move into the gaming benchmarks then, shall we? And a small footnote before we begin. All games were tested at their maximum settings with dynamic scaling and ray tracing turned off where applicable. First up then is Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3, where I saw average FPS figures at 1440p of 137.7 with a 1% low of 87.7. Increasing the resolution up to 4K saw this drop significantly, as we'd expect, but an average FPS of 85.7 and a 1% low of 57.3 is still very respectable for a 1400 quid PC. Moving on to The Witcher 3 then, a game that's been out for a while now, but it is still quite demanding, especially when running on the Ultra Plus settings that I used for my testing. At 1440p, I recorded an average FPS of 77.5 with a 1% low of 62.5, while up at 4K those figures plummeted to a 39.7 average and a 33.91% low. Another game that has been out for a while now is Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and it still manages to look great years after its release. At 1440p, the Quantum Pro S managed 167.5 FPS on average with a 133.91% low. Bumping the resolution up to 4K saw that average FPS drop to 88.8 and the 1% low come in at 75.8. Both very respectable results for maximum settings at that resolution. Cyberpunk 2077 then, and this is renowned for being a challenging game to run smoothly at high settings and resolutions. The system managed an 81.8 average FPS at 1440p with a 1% low of 63.4, and at 4K an average FPS of exactly 40 along with a 1% low figure of 30.5. The first racing title in my list of games tested on the Quantum Pro S is F1 23, and it performed very well. At 1440p the average FPS was a very healthy 176.2 with a 137.61% low. And that experience stays fast and fluid at 4K with an average FPS result of 119.1 and a 1% low of 95.8. Moving on to the latest title from the world of Assassin's Creed then, Mirage. Performance was great at 1440p, average FPS was 119.1 and 1% lows were 87.2. The machine also impressed at 4K in this title, exceeding the 60 FPS that I look for when playing single player games and reaching an average FPS of 74.6 with 1% lows of 59.6. The other racing game in my benchmarks then is Forza Motorsport, the latest title from the Forza franchise. The graphics in this game are really impressive at max settings, and the Quantum Pro S just about handled it at 1440p. Average FPS was 78.5 and 1% low readings came out at 64.7. 4K didn't take as much of a hit as I'd expected, with average FPS sitting just below 60 at 58.5 and then those 1% lows coming in at 51.2. You could quite easily get a stable 60 FPS at 4K with a few settings tweaks and turning down some of the more demanding graphics options. Moving on to Hogwarts Legacy then, and this performed okay at 1440p. Again with maximum settings, the average FPS of 88.7 was acceptable, but the title was let down by poor 1% lows at both 1440p and 4K. Moving on to A Plague Tale Requiem then, and this is no doubt one of the nicest looking games I've ever played. If you haven't played it, I highly recommend checking it out, it's on Game Pass. But it performed well on the Quantum Pro S. 1440p saw an average FPS result of 118.5 with a 1% low of 90.9. While 4K saw those figures drop down a bit to 72.7 and 56.8 respectively. Still more than enough to game at max settings and at a high resolution on a game that looks as good as that, so that's a win in my book. The final game in my list then is Starfield, the hyped Bethesda RPG that kind of fell flat after launch. Again, we're running maximum settings here, and at 1440p the average FPS was above the magic 60 that I look for, especially when playing single player games, sitting at 75.5 with a 1% low of 56 on the dot. Turning the resolution up to 4K though resulted in a disappointing 47 average FPS and a 1% low of 36.4. It's just a little bit too much for this system to handle. Finally then, to provide a wider look at the performance of this machine, we have the average FPS results taken across the 10 titles that are tested at both 1440p and 4K. Obviously this chart takes all games into account, so the more demanding titles such as Starfield and Cyberpunk will bring the averages down. That being said though, the performance of the Quantum Pro S with games at maximum settings is still great at 1440p and I think acceptable in some titles at 4K. With a few settings tweaks in certain titles, things could be improved without affecting the graphical quality too much. So now I want to talk about esports and content creation, streaming, that sort of stuff, especially when using a single PC, which is what I'm doing here. I've not got no dual PC setup. This is just the PCSpecialist PC on the desk behind me. We're going to have OBS running and recording using the 4070 Super's built-in NVENC encoders. We'll just see how this PC handles it and whether it's suitable for running content and creating content with a one PC, single PC setup. So here we are in Apex Legends. We're going to jump into a game. I'm recording at 1440p, upscaling to 4K. OBS is reporting 0.2%. The settings I have changed just to be, they're not at their max. I've just increased FOV. They're kind of on middle of the road settings. Some things on low, some things on medium, a few things on high. But this is the kind of settings you'd run. I'm not an Apex Legends expert, so I don't know the absolute best settings, but I've turned things down a bit just to keep things as smooth as I can. So let's dive into a game and see how this PC handles recording and gaming at the same time. So here we go then. We're into a game of duos on Apex, a game I haven't played that much, admittedly. I haven't played it for ages. Frame rate's looking around 130, 140 mark. Let's jump and see what happens. Frame rate's holding steady through this gunfight, so I've run out of ammo. So this game is actually going alright. I am noticing a little bit of stuttering though, but we're into the last 10, final 10, which is good for me. I'll never play this game. So that was Apex Legends then, and it ran okay. I captured it okay. There was a few stutters here and there, but the frame rate held at a kind of nice level, and OBS just breezed through capturing it. So let's move on to look at another game. So we're in Counter-Strike 2. Default graphics settings, I haven't changed anything. We're still recording at 1440p, upscaling to 4K. Frame rate in the menu is about 120 from what I'm seeing. In the top left corner, that's NVIDIA frame view, you can see. Let's join a match on Dust 2, a free-for-all, and see how it handles it. So we're in the game. The frame rate's around 250, 220 to 250. Dropping slightly, but it's more than playable. Obviously, this game was always going to have high frame rate. It's running smooth. OBS is stating 0% CPU usage. Again, this is a single PC setup, recording. Oh. So let's move on to look at a different game, something a bit different. So here we are in a solo game of Warzone. FPS while I'm diving down is looking about 160. Again, I'm still recording at 1440p and upscaling to 4K with OBS. OBS is reporting 0.1% CPU usage, but that is due to us using the encoder on the graphics card rather than using CPU encoding. So the FPS is dipped below 100, then it felt a bit choppy. But it seems to be handling it okay. I mean, it's not the best experience in the world, but it's doing its job. Spotted our first person, and frame rate still around 140. There's one person, frame rate holding steady. The game feels good, to be fair, even while recording, pushing the computer kind of to its limits. What's GPU's on 70 odd percent, CPU on 70 odd percent, so there's some headroom there as well. And again, I'm recording at 1440p, upscaling to 4K. Streaming would be a little bit more demanding than this, but only really on upload rate, and depending what encoder that you were using. See if we can spot some more people, hit some more snipes. There's two. 1% lows, around, dropped to 60 something then, 70, 90. There's 3 kills. So this computer, and especially the 4070 Super that I found in it, is more than capable of creating content and capturing your gameplay as you're playing. You don't need a dual PC setup, although that's what a lot of big streamers use. It is a nice to have, but you can get started with just the one PC. Especially this PC, it will more than handle it. So that's it then. I'm going to wrap up this little content creation, streaming, esportsy type section. I didn't feature that many esports games, but this PC will more than handle popular games at high frame rates that make it enjoyable, and you are able to capture it using OBS on the same PC at the same time. Finally, let's take a look at thermal performance, noise levels, and power usage, with and without the ASUS performance enhancement setting I mentioned earlier, on all charts aside from the graphics temperature, because all of the gaming that I did had that performance on just to get the most FPS that I could. CPU package power was kept to very conservative levels when using the lower power limits of 65 and 154 watts, which led to the reduced Cinebench multi-core performance that we saw earlier in the video. Removing these limits allows the CPU to stretch its legs a lot more and maintain higher clock speeds, hence why we see 145 watt usage during the Cinebench test. And that heightened power usage that I just mentioned is obviously going to generate more heat, but the 86 degrees measured during Cinebench is well within the safe operating limits of this CPU, and we have to remember that that's a sustained benchmark. The 48 and 51 degree results from the 30-minute Cyberpunk test, they more realistically represent the sort of temperatures that would be seen when using this gaming PC for gaming, which is what it's going to be used for the majority of the time. Idle temps were roughly the same at 27 and 28 degrees respectively. GPU temperatures then were measured in a 30-minute Cyberpunk test, and while using the boosted power limits and clock speeds, were 73 degrees for the GPU, 83 degrees for the hotspot, and 85 degrees for the memory. And this is with the game running at maximum settings at 1440p resolution, so the GPU was definitely putting some work in. Those figures are in line with what we've been seeing from other 4070 Supers so far. The additional heat from the CPU using more power does make a noticeable difference to the noise levels, especially when running a Cinebench benchmark, with the total system noise levels rising from 38 to 50 decibels when measured at about 20 centimeters away on my desk. Noise levels while gaming and when idle were not affected too much though, with only slight changes to the fan noise in both scenarios. Finally then, I measured the total system power usage at the wall socket, and it was a similar story. The only significant difference came when running a Cinebench benchmark. With restrictive power limits, the system used a total of 137 watts, but by placing those increased power limits, essentially delimiting the power to the CPU, it saw those figures increase to 256 watts, as was to be expected. Idle figures were exactly the same in both scenarios at 65 watts, and gaming in Cyberpunk 2077 saw a difference of 3 watts, which can be put down to margin of error. So there we have it then. That was the Quantum Pro S pre-built desktop PC from PCSpecialist. As I mentioned earlier, the majority of the budget, I feel, definitely went on the GPU, which is by no means a bad thing, and that's how it should be in a gaming PC. The gaming performance was great for the most part, and could be stretched even further by tweaking some settings in multiplayer games. As I said, for my testing, everything is just on max. The CPU is a good pairing for the GPU, I think, and it does its job well. Content creation would be 100% possible on this machine with the RTX 4070 Super. It handled encoding like a champ, to be fair. RAM could be faster. I've said that in most of my pre-built reviews, but in this one, it isn't going to be as much of an issue as in some of the Ryzen-based systems that I've looked at. Storage is plentiful at 2 terabytes. I was pleased to see that over a 1 terabyte drive, and there's room for more if you ever wanted to or needed to add another drive in there. There's another M.2 slot, and then you've got SATA if you want to go down that route. The case is pretty basic and it feels a bit cheap. That's one area I'd probably look at customising if I were to order one of these for myself. PCSpecialist allow you to customise pretty much anything during the ordering process. But with that being said, the Spectrum 2 compact case that comes as standard, it does the job. If this were my system, I'd definitely turn ASUS Performance Enhancement Mode on and get from the get-go as soon as I got it, as the temperatures and the noise were manageable and the performance gains far outweighed any negative point from turning that on, in my opinion. Overall, a decent PC featuring one of the latest NVIDIA graphics cards at a price that isn't going to break the bank. I kind of liked it. And that's it for the video, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. Please leave a like down below if you did. Don't forget to subscribe to Kit Guru to keep up with the latest PC gaming news and reviews. If you want to go down below the video to check out our merch, there's some links to some of that stuff. And then in the description, there'll be links to our Patreon page, our Discord server, and our website. Anyway, guys, I've been Matt. This has been the Quantum Pro S from PC Specialist, featuring the RTX 4070 Super, pre-built PC. It's pretty good, handles content creation, games pretty well. I liked it. I'll speak to you later. Look after yourselves.